Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Sean Connor, the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau. Sean is based in Berlin, where the offices of the Peace Bureau are located, but he's originally from the United States and holds a degree from the State University of New York and the 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦 in Berlin. He is heading the Peace Bureau since 2022. Sean, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Pascal. It's good to be here.
Sean, can we start with a little bit of background on the Peace Bureau, like its history and what you've been up to, and when you took over, like how was that? What was the state of the Peace Bureau? When was that especially?
Sure, absolutely. So the International Peace Bureau is quite an old organization. We were founded in 1891. Incorporated in 1892. So we have over 130 years of history at this point. In those early days, of course, it was much different than what we see with the International Peace Bureau at the moment. There was a big movement around the end of the 19th century in Europe in particular, after several wars had ravaged the continent, especially middle and upper class groups that were coming together as civil society organizations to oppose militarism, present alternatives, and to draw attention to the destructiveness to individuals, to societies of wars on the continent. So you had several of these organizations come together, and the International Peace Bureau came out of the need for an organization to coordinate among these usually national organizations for annual peace conferences and other occasions in which these groups would come together to discuss a variety of issues. So that was sort of the early origins. I think I have to mention one activist in particular who was one of the key figures in the founding of the International Peace Bureau, and that is 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦, who many people know. She's the author of the book Lay Down Your Weapons, or Die Waffen nieder, a very powerful early text for pacifism and anti-war movement at the time. Of course, she was one of many people who came together for our founding. And at the time, we were founded in Bern in Switzerland, shortly after we moved to Geneva. And of course, the International Peace Bureau, we won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1910 for our efforts to bring peace movements together. Of course, not too long after this, we had two world wars, which were a excruciatingly difficult time for peace movements, especially in Europe, but around the world, as different groups had different responses to the wars that were breaking out at the time, the issues of just wars, what was a just war, what's not a just war, the growing nationalism in country, which enveloped a lot of people into defending, quote unquote, their own countries against the attacks of other countries. We of course now know in hindsight, World War I and World War II were very, in many cases, very unnecessary wars, or at least wars that spiraled out of control due to a lack of diplomacy and alternative efforts to address the crises that were unfolding in those times. But beyond that, it was, for the IPB and for peace movements in general, a very, very difficult time. We came out of the movements, came out of the wars quite smaller. We had lost a lot of our membership at the time, and had the need to rebuild in especially the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, this turned out to be quite a natural effort, as well, as we saw that despite the end of these two world wars, the militarism on a global scale was not going anywhere. We had the increasing tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States and their political blocs. At the times, we had a lot of proxy wars that were carried out in other countries, and of course the the issue of nuclear weapons at the forefront, especially in the 1980s, where we saw just how destructive these weapons had become, especially with the development of the hydrogen bomb. So a lot of these issues continued to have a forefront in peace movements. The peace movements moved more towards a middle-class movement from the upper societies to more of a people's movement as well during this period. We had mass mobilizations in many parts of the world, which resulted in the partial test ban treaty for nuclear weapons, and to some degree the comprehensive test ban treaty, although the verdict is partially still out there. And many other efforts. One, of course, I have to highlight in the 1980s. It began, or was mostly at the time, a movement from diplomats and politicians, but the movement for common security as well, which was inspired by activities of the peace movement. The need to move away from constant militarism and growing military spending on armaments, to reductions in military spending and the need to create security together. This was an effort that led to several treaties between the US and Soviet Union and many of the European partners as well, which reduced tensions in the 1980s as the Cold War was beginning to wind down. So these were, I guess, some of the activities IPB was involved in those times. As the Cold War more or less came to an end in the 1990s, the peace movement had another period of sort of questioning, what is our future? What do we do? Of course, we know that also didn't last long, as the US took several actions in the early 2000s, invading Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other cases in which the peace movement again had to mobilize. I think, yeah, those especially the early peace activities in 2003 against the US invasion of Iraq was a very strong movement for the IPB at the time. And so we've managed to keep going and keep some of our basic principles, but at the same time, we've also really grown and developed in many ways. As I noted at the beginning, IPB started out more or less as a European or Euro-Atlantic organization. We are now really a global network of peace and peace-related organizations working on every continent of the world. We have members, excuse me, I just needed water quick.
Go ahead. You told me before we started you were just recovering from a really bad flu, so
yep.
Sorry about
that. Yep. Yeah, thank you. So we have members now in over 80 countries around the world, a total of over 400 member organizations. We do function primarily as a network, more so than anything else, in coordinating efforts between organizations in different parts of the world. We have regional networks in many parts of the world now, including an African network, an Asian Pacific network, and many others that serve to address issues in particular geographic locations. So this is, I think, a really important part of our development over the years, is that we move a bit away from a Eurocentric point of view on war to really a more global understanding of it. This has also led us to begin the shift in our motto, which was always for a world without war, to include also the concept of a positive peace, the need for really something sustainable, that the absence of war is not necessarily peace, but much more work needs to be done. This also includes linking peace to other important issues, whether it be climate change, whether it be economic inequality or racial inequality, and workers' rights, the rights of unions as well, is something we find very closely tied to our work. So really, that's also been a big shift in IPB's approach, especially in the past 5 to 10 years, I would say here.
The IPB is really fascinating because it is so old. And you've really, I mean, in my perception, the IPB stayed true to its original mission statement of trying to be pro-peace and anti-war. And this is very different, especially right now, from what we are seeing, what some other organizations are doing. Just 2 weeks ago, I had a talk with a Dutch peace activist, and he told me that the biggest peace organization in the Netherlands, PAX, actually became very pro, let's send weapons to Ukraine in order to bring peace to the country, right? And got on board with the General Secretary of NATO, who literally said weapons are the way to peace. And the IPB is not doing that. The IPB, you decided to go the opposite way and actually support grassroots peace movements. If I'm informed correctly, you were also part of the people who went to Vienna in summer to the peace summit that was done with 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗁 and with 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦 was there, and a lot of these people who are like actually generally saying, look, the only way to get to peace is through negotiation. So we need to talk. Weapons are not going to make it better. Weapons kill more people. How is it that you were able to resist that general wave of madness that overtook even a lot of organized peace institutions? And secondly, what was the impact of 2022 on you guys? And I know that you started in 2022 at the IPB. Can you maybe explain that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. First, maybe just to say, we were the central organizer of the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine. So we were the initiators of that. Of course, we had many, many great partners that played an essential role to making that happen. And together it was possible, but it, of course, was not easy as well. So I actually began with IPB in 2020, but not as executive director. I came into the executive director role in 2022, as you rightfully said. But I was with the organization before, so I learned a lot in those years prior to the invasion, which also has helped in this time of transition. But to come to, I guess, the main question here, it's of course a very complicated issue with Ukraine, like most or pretty much every war is. It's never an easy solution, and I want that to be emphasized first. You know, we at IPB definitely see that Ukrainians do have a right to self-defense. However, we are concerned about the growing militarism around the war in Ukraine, and the role of outside countries that aren't directly involved in the war, including prior to the war. You know, our engagement in Ukraine did not begin in 2022. Like most peace movements, we have been involved in work in Ukraine since 2014, or in many cases even earlier, having some contacts there, and also, of course, following what the Russians have been doing, what the US and the West have been doing as well, in basically creating a vicious cycle leading down the path eventually to war. But we've seen, of course, with the breakaway regions in the Donbass, that the Ukrainians as well, you know, there was already a war going on between these breakaway regions with Russian support and the rest of Ukraine with Western support. The war was already happening. And of course, we followed the Minsk agreements, and you may have seen as well, after the war broke out, that former German Chancellor Angela Merkel had reported to a newspaper that that Germany and the Western allies did not negotiate Minsk II in good faith.
They never meant it.
No, that it was just a stopgap measure to militarize Ukraine and to prepare for war. So the West knew the war was coming. There's also, of course, the issue of NATO, which is an issue that IPB has been working on for a long time. We've seen the role that NATO has played in several of the wars I was mentioning earlier, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya, or even going back, of course, to the breakup of Yugoslavia. So NATO's role, while in some ways it can be productive, also as a military alliance of the West, has certain interests that they are seeking to meet, which can come at the expense of local populations. So we've also, of course, followed that work, and Russia, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, had sent a list of demands to the West, basically demanding that NATO does not spread any further eastward. We could go back, as Dr. 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦 often does, also to the 1990s and the promise that was purportedly made at the time that the West would not expand NATO even an inch eastward. Of course, now we know that was a lie. But we also saw just last week that Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, has come out and said, yes, we had these demands from Russia that they would invade unless NATO were not to expand, and we refused to accept that. We wanted NATO to expand. You know, he said it clear as day that this is a reason. And while, of course, blackmail should not be tolerated as well, that should have been an immediate signal that we need to engage in negotiations, in diplomatic efforts to avoid this war happening, and understand that Russia does have concerns about NATO. So There's a long and complicated backstory to Ukraine. When we get into the modern moments and the question of sending weapons, again, I do see, Ukrainians wanting to defend their own territories, absolutely. However, sending high-tech weaponry to engage with a rival who has nuclear weapons and a vast arsenal of conventional weapons is not going to resolve this issue. We've seen now that the war has been going on for over a year and a half. There is more or less a stalemate in place at this point. People are dying on both sides, and there are not many prospects of a military victory either way. In fact, the only thing that would really swing this war in one direction or another would be a further escalation from what we're seeing now, which could risk expanding the war to include more partners, or even to becoming a nuclear war. And these are severe risks. We see instead the moral need for a ceasefire immediately to stop the killing on both sides, and to engage in diplomatic efforts and negotiations as a way to resolve the issue, taking into account the security needs of Russia as well as of Ukraine, in order to resolve the conflict. We hope that through negotiations, it might also be possible to resolve issues of territorial integrity, of human rights violations, and other issues of this sort. Such proposals have been made from China, from Brazil, from Mexico, and many other diplomatic efforts up to this point.
So, I mean, ever since the breakdown of the negotiations end of March in Istanbul, and then the Bucha massacre, whatever it was, but ever since then, calling for a negotiated peace was equivalent to being a Putin puppet, of being pro-Russian, of hating Ukraine. How is it that you, as the International Peace Bureau, were able to continue doing your work despite the entire media machine in the West being geared against what you just explained to us?
Yeah, it hasn't been easy, to be honest. It's quite difficult. The modern warfare is as much a communication warfare as it is anything else. Sides need to keep up their morale for their soldiers, for those within their nation, and expand the support for their missions in order to be successful. So we've seen increasing and more polarizing rhetoric on both sides. This is what happens in times of war, unfortunately. And it makes it harder for anyone to talk about peace, much less in a productive way, without being labeled a puppet of one side or another. And this is quite unfortunate. We've had several roadblocks throughout the way, including around the Vienna summit. In that case, we had a group of Austrians, as well as some Ukrainian civil society organizations, that were approaching us saying, you are not honest in your intentions. With those who took more diplomatic means to convey that message to us, we had conversations with them. We discussed our opinions, why we have the views that we have. But the more extreme elements of that led to a cancellation of the venue where the summit was supposed to take place just 2 days before the summit. We had several partners and several speakers drop out, including, for the summit, we really wanted to represent a wide range of voices, not all of which we agree with at IPB or the people attending agree with. We had people who we invited who would speak about why we need to send arms to Ukraine. And these people ended up canceling and dropping out of the conference due to the pressure of these activists who were calling us Russian propagandists. Yeah, so it's definitely a very difficult climate in which to work. We have to carry our message forward, because the alternative is just an escalating nationalism that blinds us to chances for peace. The rhetoric still on both sides is, we will win, we will fight until the war ends and we reclaim what is ours. And it's just very dangerous.
I keep saying that, it would be war would be pointless if one of the two sides said, oh, maybe I'm wrong and maybe what I'm doing isn't right. You wouldn't have a war. I mean, the whole logic of war is that both sides believe in their narrative to the point where they're ready to kill each other, right? And to go and even to die for what they believe in. That's why the whole narrative in the West, I think the West was way in the war narrative, because halfway, 75%, because the West is willing to have every Ukrainian die for what they believe in. The West is, luckily, the West is not willing to send its own boys and girls to die for what they believe in. Luckily, because otherwise it would be already the Third World War. But how did you manage? How did you manage to stay true to your message? And let me connect this with one thing. Where's your funding coming from? How do you get money?
Yep. So how we managed to stay true to our message is it's tough. First of all, I would say, you know, sometimes we put across a bit too simple of a message, and I think we are working on trying to create more of a nuanced understanding of what we're doing. But that's hard when you have social media, when you have limited really space or opportunities to express the nuance of it all. But you know, there are times where of course we question, and I think it's good to self-reflect and look back. Are we in the right here? What are the alternatives? To look deep, you know, follow each path. What happens when we send arms to Ukraine? What happens? How things escalate? Let's look at examples from the past. Plenty that could be done there to resist. You know, these are groups around the world have engaged in nonviolent resistance tactics to oppressors and occupiers for a long period of time. And in general, these can be really quite successful. Of course, not without sacrifice, but the sacrifice of war, I would say, is much greater even. So I think there certainly is also a need to embrace and investigate nonviolent techniques for resistance as an alternative to war. In terms of funding, we are really a small nonprofit. You know, we're big in scope. We're operating on a global level, but we have a small secretariat team. You know, we're just 4 people in our office right now. Yeah, our funding primarily comes from membership organizations to the International Peace Bureau. We also have partnership deals with some international trade unions who support our work. Luckily, trade unions are a historical partner of peace activists around the world. So we do receive some funding from the International Trade Union Confederation, as well as Global Union, and also quite small sums from Education International, the Teachers Trade Union, and the ITF, the International Transportation Workers Federation.
That's fantastic. So your membership funded. You're not funded by external sources that could threaten to cut you off in case you didn't do as they please.
Yeah, generally, you know, we really avoid any politically tied funding, anything that would ask us or request us or, you know, coerce us into taking a certain opinion on anything. We don't receive government funding. Occasionally for projects, we will receive funding from some German foundations that are tied to political parties, but independent in how they distribute their funds as well.
So that's very good to know that you're like independent in a real sense. But on the other hand, like, what was the impact on the IPB by 2022? Did you feel that directly, or was it the same as usual that the IPB always has to push back on pro-war narratives?
You know, for me, it's the first war that's broken out at such a scale during my time at IPB. I can speak only with limited knowledge to previous experiences, but I think the biggest impact we felt with the outbreak of the war was in our membership. You know, not all of our members agree on approaches. Some of them have very vastly differing views to the situation in Ukraine and how to support it. And so this required a lot of conversations within the organization, because we do seek to serve in some way as a canvas for our members, but at the same time as a guiding light on the other end. So we we want to guide them and show them, here is how we are viewing things, but also give them the space to share with us how they're viewing it and try to take all of that into account with how we react in a time of war like this. So we do have members who are in favor of arms trades to Ukraine, but with the condition that if we're sending you arms, then you should also be working towards negotiations and a resolution to the conflict. And then we have people completely opposed to any arms trades. There are some organizations, that focus more only on the negative role that Western countries or NATO are playing in this conflict, and there are organizations that focus only on the role that Russia is playing in its invasion here. And so, we encompass really a great wide net of organizations, and it's our job to try to bring all of that or hold some cohesiveness between those organizations, to say we can disagree, we can take different perspectives, but we are together for this idea of peace, that this war needs to end and there need to be solutions, and we should explore every possibility for how that can happen. That was really our intention with the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine that we held in Vienna, was to bring these organizations together and to have them speak to each other in a safe environment where we are civil society activists, where we can disagree, but also know that as peace activists, we should be diplomatic and listen to others with their approaches, learn everything we can, and take that forward with us. So that was really the central intention of the summit.
Do you see, what's the way forward that you see for peace movement? Because what I'm seeing is that certain groups have completely abandoned their old ways, especially also political groups. One of my biggest disillusionments is that the social democrats all over Europe have basically stopped being peace-minded and have gone full swing, whatever it takes to kill as many Russians as possible and to topple Vladimir Putin. And that is a message that I never thought I would hear from the left. And I see a lot of other organizations that have kind of gone that way. On the other hand, we see a lot of new grassroots movements in Austria, but also in Switzerland and in Germany and so on popping up and trying to do something against that narrative. How do you see the future of peace movements in general in Europe for the next 1 or 2 decades?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, maybe the most difficult question so far. It's an interesting time, of course, before my time, but in this post-World War period, I think IPB had a very similar situation we found ourselves in, where a lot of the peace movements that had existed prior to these world wars had ceased to exist or completely shifted in their nature. I'm not a political historian, so I can't say as much about the left in general there, but my understanding, my very general understanding, is also there were, of course, divisions in the left during the world wars on what role peace or war should play in the future of the party. But so I guess, like any situation, after a war ends, there's a period of reanalysis, of looking back, what was done right, what wasn't done right, questions that are hard to answer when you're in the midst of a war. And I think there is some opportunity as well for quite difficult conversations on peace, on militarism, and on how we move back from the brink. But if I'm being honest, where I see things maybe in the next 10 or 20 years heading, based on, you look at NATO's strategic papers, you look at some of the rhetoric of different left or right leaders in Europe or in the US, is the anti-China rhetoric that's coming up. Russia and the war in Ukraine is the immediate threat that everyone's talking about. But as China's economy continues and influence continue to grow around the world, the West is looking closer and closer at tensions with China on the rise. And really, I see this as the issue where we will see perhaps a new version of a peace movement coming about. And more important is completely the wrong word, excuse me there, but longer term and more driven campaign by the peace movement will need to be resisting a new Cold War between the US and China. So this, I think, will be something that even peace movements perhaps that are more militarist in their rhetoric around the war in Ukraine, hopefully will be able also to see that the growing tensions with China are extremely worrying, and that we need to find solutions there. So that's sort of what I see. If we look 20 years down the line, for example, is even 10 years at this point, we're in a very dangerous moment now. We have this immediate war, but we also have long-term strategic plans by the military of the West to contain China. And this, all it takes is one mistake. Of course, China also is a nuclear armed power, a growing military power, and there need to be sincere efforts to ensure that something like what's happened in Ukraine does not happen anywhere else from either side there. So that certainly, I think, is the primary concern of the future.
Now, cynics point out that despite peace movements being very old, and you're a wonderful example for a very old peace movement, we still had 2 world wars. We had the Vietnam War, we had older wars, we had the Afghanistan war, we had the Iraq war, we are having the Ukraine war. So what's the point? What's the point of a peace movement if war stays around? And I have my own answer to that, but I would like to hear yours.
Now, there's the very practical or academic answer to that, which I don't necessarily completely agree with, but feel like should be mentioned, and that is that if we see where the world is at with the peace movement, I would hate to see where it's at without a peace movement. That the peace movement acts as a pressuring force for good on countries to reduce the extremities of warfare, to reduce the likelihood for further wars to break out, and to just give politicians or those engaging in war how can I say this? They have to think twice before they can take actions. Basically, it's similar to how some people also will talk about the United Nations. Is the United Nations also has not been able to prevent all these wars from breaking out, which is one of their primary functions. But by being there and by drawing attention to the issues, by putting pressure on politicians, it reduces the extremities or severity of these conflicts, and puts pressure on governments to resolve them before things get worse or escalate. So I think to some degree that can be true, that at least we have small victories from time to time. Sometimes those victories are undone. When we look at US nuclear weapons being stationed in the UK, for example, the activists in the UK managed to succeed in removing US nuclear weapons, and now they're on their way back. So some of those victories are also just temporary, but it's better than not having a peace movement. But I would go beyond that too, to say, I think we've had some smaller successes. We've had some real positive influences for peace in the past, but we need to also do better. And our job at the International Peace Bureau is the coordination of peace movements. And I think this is something that also is really important. When a small movement is working on its own, or even a large movement is working on its own, it can have some direct impacts. But by bringing the movement to a global scale, by connecting activists in different parts of the world and sharing visions, having disagreements, but also learning from each other, I think we can become more effective in our work, and really work towards our mission of a world without war and a positive peace. And not just peace movements. We need to work with human rights activists. We need to work with climate activists and all the activists around the world working for a better world, because you cannot have a world without war or a positive peace if you don't have stability within societies, if you don't have governments that listen to the will of the people, and if you don't have cultural exchange for that as well. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's nothing that can be done overnight, but I think there's plenty we are learning to make our international movement more effective.
So now on a practical level, if like any of the listeners right now decide that, okay, I'm going to incorporate a peace movement in Indonesia, Jakarta, or I'm going to open up the first peace organization or movement in Malaysia, or in wherever you want to call it, or I'm going to make a new one. You know, maybe we have one, but it's useless. I'm going to make a new one. I'm going to sit together with my 3-4 friends, or with my other friends. I'm going to open up something. How can they get in touch with you, and what can you do? How can you support them?
Yeah, so we love to support, especially some of these smaller organizations, newer organizations, activists who are getting into the field, who are interested. They can get in touch with us. We have our website, ipb.org, or our email address, info@ipb-office.berlin. Contact with us. We have forms they can fill out on the website to become a member of the International Peace Bureau, and as members, then they have permission to include our logo on their materials, to work with us, to be involved in our projects and activities. We also host webinars quite frequently, different things, other webinars are more actually for newer movements, I think is quite important. And of course, we don't claim to be experts on everything that's happening in the world. So we also like to learn from our members. You know, when we have members that are working in Indonesia, for example, it's important they can also inform us what are the issues you are interested in when you talk about peace in Indonesia, because peace in Indonesia will look quite different than peace in Colombia or peace in Sudan, for example. You know, these are very different situations. And so it's important to have this exchange, this regular communication with our members, to learn from each other, to work with each other, to grow. And of course, we can also happily put them in touch with other members of ours that are working in Indonesia or in other parts of the world, but on similar issues to peace than them. So it really is about connecting them, developing strategies together, and learning.
How many members do you have, or like from how many countries do you have organizations that are affiliated with you?
Yeah, so the exact numbers can fluctuate from time to time as we're completely updating them, but roughly we have members in 80 countries and a total of around 400 members.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So it's a big network, because like
sorry, just to emphasize, those are organizational members. We also have individual members, over 1,000 individual members. So if you're also interested in topics of peace, but you don't necessarily have an organization or a network around you, you're also welcome to come into our framework and be a part of the IPB.
Which is something that I highly support, because grassroots movements are the best chances we have at uncorruptible associations to go forward. It's really hard to find an organization that goes back to 1891 that hasn't been corrupted. There are some. The interesting thing is, like, you know, the Red Cross and so on, there's a couple of large organizations who stay true to their original missions, and they survive for a long time, and they all go back before the First World War. So there is a point in that. There's a point in trying to develop the networks. I am very glad to know that you're around. Do you have are you recognizing any kind of shift in the narrative in Germany, because you're in Berlin, you're in Germany? How high is your hope at being able to overcome this goddamn war in Eastern Europe within, let's say, the next couple of months?
Yeah, Germany right now is not a beacon of hope, I would say. You know, we have the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is openly calling peace activists angels fallen to hell, and using quite extreme rhetoric. You know, that anyone who's talking about peace basically doesn't understand the current situation, is not looking at things with an honest view, and it's really quite unfortunate. So I'm really not too hopeful in the case of Germany. That being said, we do of course have some upcoming actions in and around Germany from several different peace movements that are working in the country. And again, even within Germany, the peace movements that exist are taking different perspectives. Some of them don't want to focus necessarily on ceasefire negotiations. Other ones, that is the central call. But I'm sad to say I'm not too hopeful at this moment in Germany. We have heard for the past month or two now, that the stalemates after the Ukrainian counteroffensive could lead some politicians to toning down their rhetoric, at least on fighting to the last drop of blood. I haven't seen that so much turn into rhetoric by the politicians yet, but we'll have to see, what happens in the coming months. And as the winter rolls around, I think it will be another quite difficult winter, especially for Ukrainians, but also here in Germany, given the increase in cost of basic essentials for living, but especially energy and heating costs. So we'll see. Maybe that also will play a role here. I'd like to be more hopeful. I think there are some beacons of hope elsewhere, and I would say where I hold out the most hope still is the G77 plus China group, which met just recently in La Habana in Cuba, and they continue to be the group that's talking about resolving the conflict, about the need for negotiation, ceasefire, diplomatic solutions. So this, or the BRICS group as well. The BRICS is a bit tainted because, of course, it includes Russia directly in it. But these other countries, Brazil, India, China, do have some stronger role that they might be able to play in diplomatic solutions.
Maybe last question for personal interest, also because of the name of this channel. Why is it that the International Peace Bureau moved from a neutral country to Germany? Why are you guys in Germany now and not in Switzerland anymore?
Yeah, it's more of a practical matter than anything else. Our previous executive director was German, had good German contacts, and was able to make the move. Cost-wise, it's also quite a bit cheaper to be here in Berlin than it is in Geneva. Geneva is quite an expensive city. So the primary matters were that we do maintain an office in Geneva still to this day. It is close to the United Nations and many international organizations that continue to do their work there. But practically, it was just an easier matter for us to move our headquarters to Berlin. We also have an office in Barcelona at the moment. So we have sort of this 3 offices system in order to cover different areas.
Okay, and that reminds me that very last question. You told me right before we started rolling that you were in Geneva only a week ago, or only a couple of days ago, and you actually met with the activists of Okinawa, and not only activists, but the governor of Okinawa, who is very actively campaigning against the relocation of the US base in Okinawa to another place in Okinawa. And this is a very interesting case of regional diplomacy, right? Where a prefecture in Japan tries to be on the international stage and then lobby for its peace-related issues. Can you tell us a little bit how that went and what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the case of Okinawa is quite extreme and quite concerning. Okinawa hosts 23 U.S. military bases, an extraordinary number for a series of quite small islands that are less than 500 miles from Taiwan and around 500 miles from the coast of China as well. So very close to an area of concern moving forward. Of course, they've been a U.S. military base and were even ruled by the U.S. For a long period after World War II. But in this case in particular, you have a number of factors contributing to sort of the decline in well-being of the people of Okinawa, whether it be the horrendous acts that have been carried out by some U.S. soldiers that have been stationed in Okinawa, whether it be the environmental degradation of these military bases that have leaked PFAS, these I'm gonna mess up the exact thing. I think it's polyfluoroalkyl substances, if I'm not mistaken, which are harmful chemicals to humans, which get into drinking water and into the ground, which can prevent crops from growing. Whether it be this reconstruction or new construction of a base, as you were mentioning, which has the potential to harm over 200 endangered species, including dugongs that live off of the coast of Okinawa, or the noise pollution of planes day and night going off over the top of residential areas of Okinawa. So you have a large number of concerns, and this most recent renovation or moving of the military base to a new location, there you had the governor of Okinawa who went to the courts, the Supreme Courts of Japan, appealing for a consideration of another location. And just a few weeks ago, they denied the request and said that the Okinawa prefecture must follow the federal government of Japan's decision, which is a great ignorance of democracy, of the voices of local people, 77% of whom do not support this relocation of the military base. So with all of this in mind and this drastic situation, I think, especially for the governor, little choice remains but to go out and ask beyond Japan, help us. You know, we are in a dire situation. The U.S. military bases are overwhelming us. We need some support for this. And so that was really the central point of his decision to go to the Human Rights Council in Geneva to bring up the human rights concerns that he has here. My role, of course, was coming in and speaking more about some of the geopolitical matters that are at stake here. When you have over 200 U.S. military bases in the Asia Pacific, basically forming a line around China, this is of great concern. You know, the Chinese have one overseas military base in Africa, and it's the potential for these tensions to grow, and the U.S. leading that is extremely concerning. So we wanted to bring that a little bit into the framework as well, and that if war were to break out, Okinawa is on the front lines of that war, and the residential, you know, the civilians that are living there would be the victims of aggression in that case. And so we have to walk back from the edge, and we also have to engage in efforts to make sure that militarism is not destroying the lives of indigenous peoples around the world, whether it be in Okinawa or whether it be in the island of Guam, which is a U.S. territory, also which does not have a democratic vote, and 1/3 of the island is occupied by U.S. military. So these are concerns we find really important as well to bring in when we talk about militarism around the globe.
Now, this is a very, very concrete issue, and you know, the people of Okinawa have been suffering for the longest time from being the only place in Japan where the Second World War was then actually fought on their territory inside Japan. The other places were bombed, but you didn't have like US soldiers fighting. And then the 25-30 years of occupation, and then another form of occupation by basically the Japanese government being okay with the United States taking like 20, 30, 40, 50% of the islands for bases. And these bases are a huge liability, because if there is a war between China, Taiwan, and by proxy China and the United States, it's almost impossible for Japan to remain outside of that, because if the United States even just deploys troops and so on from Okinawa, China would, just by the rationale of military logic, have to do something about it, which would bring Japan in. This is a big tripwire, and this tripwire is highly dangerous, because that's exactly the kind of BS that got us the First World War, that you kind of that you create systems in which, like, you don't have a small war, but you have a huge war. So, and that the people of Okinawa will be the ones doing the dying, right? Just as it's going to be the Taiwanese doing the dying, and the soldiers, the poorest of the poor in China who are going to do the dying, just as it's in the Ukraine and Russia. It's always the poorest of the poor that do the dying. Do you have do you see a chance for this approach? Because this is interesting. It's interesting that the regional level tries to go to the highest level they have, even above the nation, going to the Human Rights Council. Is that a way forward also for other regions to make their grievances heard?
I think in cases where you're left with little other option, I think that's what needs to be done. But it's not just limited to, I guess, the highest levels in the sense of the UN, but Mr. Tumaki-san, the governor, has also recently visited China, for example. He was in the city of Fuzhou, where he met with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, to discuss the cultural history of Okinawa, which was at one point called the Ryukyu Islands, and maintained diplomatic relations with both Japan and China in quite a friendly sense. So there's, I think, also a real important need for cultural diplomacy, for showing the connections between peoples of different parts of the world, and not just necessarily the highest level, but also looking for these opportunities to reduce tensions on regional levels. I think that's quite important.
That makes very good sense, because the logic of war always tries to cut all connections between peoples. That's how you get them to kill each other. So the point of a peace movement is to create as many connections among the peoples as possible. Sean Connor, I thank you very much for today.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Excuse me that I was sick and maybe a little bit hard to hear.
No problem. Thank you for coming online. See you next time.
Of course. Thank you. Bye.